I'll be candid, I don't even know where or who made the decision of the 11 September thing. I frankly thought it was actually inappropriate at the moment in time.
Did you set the date for the withdrawal?
No, I did not. By the middle of July, I was concerned about the different pace of Department of Defense planning as compared to Department of State planning.
You accomplished your mission. Every soldier, sailor, airman, and Marine accomplished their mission. This country was defended for 2 decades.
General Milley, when did you know that the drone strike was a failure?
When did I know that the
Drone
strike
strike
was a mistake?
on the civilian taking water to his family was a failure.
No, I remember. Lying implies we were intentionally trying to deceive. That is not what, I know that's not what I was doing.
It's a pretty big mistake, sir.
It's shameful.
And he told me the only thing generals ever gave him was a hard time. So I fully expect to get that from you all. You don't need to write that down, but that's just me personally.
On April 14th, 2021, President Biden announced the United States would unilaterally withdraw its military forces from Afghanistan. For months before that announcement, the intelligence community and his senior military advisors, including both gentlemen testifying here today, issued dire warnings about the withdrawal's consequences. After the announcement, I, along with other Republican and Democrat members of Congress, urged the president to prepare for the withdrawal and its inevitable fallout. Unfortunately, those warnings were ignored.
There's little question in my mind that had the United States, that either president's agreement to withdraw, if we didn't withdraw 100%, then we would have been back at war with the Taliban.
With respect to the decision by President Biden to announce September 11th as the deadline for full U.S. military withdrawal, was there any tactical or military reason for that date?
Not that I'm aware of.
Not that I know.
Okay. So was it purely political and from the standpoint of a symbolic date from your understanding?
I'll be candid, I don't even know where or who made the decision of the 11 September thing. I frankly thought it was actually inappropriate at the moment in time, but it was very rapidly changed to the end of August.
And you were never involved in the decision to do that?
Not to pick the date, no.
Okay. General McKenzie, you stated in your opening statement that you and you alone are responsible for the military operations that occurred during the withdrawal. Again, I asked, did you set the date for the withdrawal?
No, I did not.
Did you make the decision to bring our troop level to 0?
I did not.
President Biden is the commander-in-chief. Did he make those decisions?
Yes, he did.
So is it your position that he bears no responsibility for the aftermath, that you are the only one that bears the responsibility for the military operations?
So I was responsible for military operations. The commander-in-chief is responsible for those and all the other operations, to include those of the Department of State, all the other appropriate cabinet agencies. But
you report to the commander-in-chief?
I do.
Okay, so at the end of the day, is he responsible for the decision to set the date and to set the troop level to 0?
Yes.
So he bears responsibility, not just you?
That's correct.
Okay. General Milley, you told the Senate and House Armed Services Committees in September of 2021 that one provision of the Doha Agreement the Taliban adhered to was the most important one, which was do not attack us or the coalition forces. You said that the Taliban did not attack U.S. and coalition forces. Didn't the Taliban carry out at least some attacks against U.S. and coalition bases in 2021, including indirect fire attacks?
There were, but the Taliban themselves, the senior leaders who were part of this negotiation, they would deny that. The Taliban's a very amorphous organization. You know, you never can be certain if they have total control over their individual units with indirect fire. There were some attacks. The issue was a lethal attack. Really, that's the fundamental piece.
General Milley, do you think mistakes were made in either the planning phases, things that we thought were going to happen that didn't happen, or things on the ground that unfolded that we didn't plan for? You think mistakes were made in all of that thought process?
There's zero doubt in my mind there were mistakes made, and that's the point of the after-action reviews. Identify those mistakes and develop solutions to implement them in the future. And I think the fundamental mistake, fundamental flaw, was the timing of the State Department call of the NEO. I think that was too slow and too late, and that then caused a series of events that result in the very last couple of days. There's a lot of other mistakes that are made along the way. I try to cover them in a written statement to submit to you guys. But I think that was, germane to this particular hearing. I think that was key. I think that was fundamental.
On accountability, I've asked the State Department officials who was responsible for the catastrophic emergency evacuation. Not surprisingly, they point their fingers at the Department of Defense. But I want to set the record straight. While the DoD helps conduct the emergency evacuation, it's a State Department that is responsible under law for developing the plan and leading the evacuation. Is that your understanding?
Yes. The State Department is the lead federal agency for planning and execution, oversight of the execution of the non-combatant operation. And the Department of Defense is in support of, and other departments are in support of the State Department. The State Department's the lead federal agency for NEOs. That's correct.
General McKenzie?
I agree with that.
And it's a State Department responsible under law, again, for requesting the emergency evacuation. Is that correct?
That is correct, and I think actually, I think that's done at the ambassadorial level, to tell you the truth. I'd have to check the law, but I think the ambassador can make the decision to execute a NEO, but typically it'll be him or the Secretary of State.
And did the State Department, specifically Embassy Kabul, have an evacuation plan for Afghanistan?
So, Chairman, every embassy has an evacuation plan for Afghanistan, and Embassy Kabul had a plan, had what we would call an F-77 list, which is the list of U.S. Citizens and their families that are in the country. And we struggled to gain access to that plan and work with them over the months of July until we finally got a decision to execute the NEO, which, as I've already mentioned, occurred on the 14th of August. Now, we worked with the embassy before then, but we didn't have authority to move out and do the things that you have to do to make a NEO happen until the 14th of July, or correction, the 14th of August. And as I noted, we were in extremis at that point.
And August 14th, just days before the fall of Kabul and the evacuation of the embassy. August 14th is when they finally put forward this plan?
Now, that's when we got authority to execute the plan.
That's when you got authority to, and you urged the White House and State Department to put pen to paper to develop a plan to get Americans and our Afghan allies out of Afghanistan, correct?
Yes, I did. In fact, I was concerned by the middle of July. I was concerned about the different pace of Department of Defense planning as compared to Department of State planning. And I took an opportunity then to make representations to the Secretary about my concern over that, the fact that we were moving pretty fast on this. They were not moving fast, and I was concerned that we were going to arrive at different locations just based on it. And I went to the Secretary. We spent some time talking about that, and actually followed up with a written idea on some things that we could do. Sent a letter with 10 recommendations to the Secretary of Defense on that.
Our mission, the U.S. military mission statement, was to prevent an attack on the United States of America from the territory of Afghanistan. That mission was accomplished for 20 consecutive years. You accomplished your mission. Every soldier, sailor, airman, and Marine accomplished their mission. This country was defended for 2 decades.
General Milley, General McKenzie, was the ROE, were the rules of engagement at the time of the Abbey Gate incident sufficient for service members like Tyler Vargas to protect themselves?
So it's my judgment they were, and we went in with what we call the standard Chairman Joint Chiefs of Staff ROE with supplements for Afghanistan. There's three main components to it. First of all, the inherent right of self-defense. A U.S. service member anywhere in the world at any time has the right to defend him or herself against a threat. It does not have to be an action that you're defending against. It can be intent interpreted. So we're operating under that threat, under that ROE. At the same time, we had extended what we call collective self-defense to our friends, partners, and allies that are there. So you could take actions to defend the Brits. You could take actions to defend your Afghan partners. The third component of that was we used what we call direct action authorities, which allowed you to strike people that were not in direct contact with you, particularly in relationship to Kabul if they posed a self-defense threat. So the last point I would say is we exercised self-defense with lethal effect 3 times during the defense of Kabul on 16, 20, and I believe 22 and 26 August.
Okay, so sticking with the Abbey Gate incident, General McKenzie, you said there was no specific attack attacker intelligence or no specific intelligence existed and that there was nobody on the bolo that fit that description. Does that remain true today?
It does.
So were you aware, after the Abbey Gate attack, were you aware that service members at the gate had requested the ability to service the target, so to speak? Were you aware of that?
No, I would not be aware of that.
And it's understandable that a combatant commander might not be aware of what service members right on the line are aware of. But post that circumstance, were you concerned about the intelligence you were getting regarding the action you were about to take on the would-be attackers and that network?
Sure. So on or about the 26th, we were tracking 4 broad, very active, very concerning threat streams. We were looking at the threat of a vehicle-borne
Right.
IED, a person-borne IED, which actually was the modality of the Abbey Gate attack.
Right.
We were looking at indirect fire, rockets and
Right.
mortars, and we were looking at an insider attack, someone who gets in and blows himself up in the terminal.
Right.
So we had dozens of, and I
But you
prefer to-
had nothing fitting the description of what your service members on the gate,
we
on
had
the
a
line
lot of
had.
descriptions of men and
So when the service member on the line is looking at the attacker based on the description and he's got the rules of engagement, but the rules of engagement at that point require him to check with his commander, go up the line, and he does not get approval. That's exceptionally concerning. I understand the fog of war. I get the circumstance you're in, but there's a man sitting here that's been blown up because he couldn't get the answer that he needed. So on Thursday, August 26th, the Abbey Gate attack happens. 3 days later, on August 29th, the drone strike occurs. Now, you said that we had up to 6 Reapers following this car around for 8 hours, and that I think up to 60 pieces of intelligence that proved that these were the people that had just attacked the Abbey Gate.
no, sir, that's not correct.
Well, that's what I've got here for open source reporting. Okay, maybe some of that's not correct, but regardless of the fact, on the 29th, the drone strike occurs, kills 10, 7 of them children. 5 days later, the Pentagon admits there was a mistake. 5 days later. General Milley, when did you know that the drone strike was a failure?
When did I know that the
Drone
strike
strike
was a mistake?
on the civilian taking water to his family
Yeah,
was a failure.
No, I remember. When did I know it? I
It
probably
was 5 days before the Pentagon said it was a mistake. When did you know?
probably day 4, day 5, in that range. I didn't know it right away, if that's what your question is.
And who did you tell when you knew?
Well, I think it came up through me to the Secretary of Defense. I
Say
don't
that again,
remember the
from
exact-
you to the SecDef?
Well, it would have come from General McKenzie would have called me. I don't remember the specifics, but General McKenzie would have called me and said, we have an incident that.
Does
was a mistake."
anybody else in the Biden administration know at that point that it's a failure?
I honestly don't know.
Because the whole time they're telling us secondary explosions, we got the target, lying to the
right.
American people, not having a clue. Who did you tell?
I tell the Secretary of Defense, and of course, if we have a principals meeting, we go through the details of the strike. But I guess I'm trying to. If you're saying, did I tell the President of the United States or whomever, other than the Secretary of Defense, that there was a mistake? I think, and I'm doing this from memory, I think Frank McKenzie, General McKenzie, would have called me, and I would have informed the Secretary of Defense, or he would have called the Secretary of Defense, which is his chain of command, and I might have been in there at the time. I don't recall the actual date-time group, nor the individual that I mentioned to. But for several days, it was my impression that the procedures were executed correctly and that we struck a target that we thought was an enemy. There was a mistake made. It's a tragic mistake
It's huge.
of war.
And we lied to the American people for 5 days and all these families
We
who
were
thought.
lying, though, Congressman. Lying implies we were intentionally trying to deceive. That is not what, I know that's not what I was doing.
It's a pretty big mistake, sir. I yield the balance.
My only real severe issue that I've had as of late, General McKenzie, is that you've made multiple comments in the media and otherwise to the extent that a brave hero, in my opinion, who has sacrificed his limbs for this country, Sergeant Tyler Vargas Andrews, that his recollection of the events that took place on August 26, to quote you, sir, that he was not recalling this correctly. Well, part of this. Where were you on August 26, sir?
Tampa, Florida.
Well, I can tell you where Sergeant Vargas Andrews was, and he was sitting at the gate. And I would trust on-ground information far more than someone who's sitting 9, 10, 11,000 miles away, who's potentially watching from ISR and potentially being briefed by the commanders on the ground, that his testimony, which has been corroborated, by the way, by multiple Marines who have testified before this committee, that the events that he has actually made common and made clear actually did take place. And we're fortunate enough, General McKenzie, that the gentleman who actually endured the most from this, who was on the ground, and ground truth matters, as we all know, is sitting right there. So would you like the opportunity to tell Sergeant Vargas right there that he is not recalling the incidents that occurred on August 26 correctly, that he and his fellow Marines are not actually the ones who said there was a bolo of this description, that he is incorrect in his assessment, which is putting into question his integrity? Do you want to face him and tell him that before him now?
I don't want to face him and tell him that. I want to say that the battlefield is a very complex place. There are a lot of threats that were flowing around out there that day. I honor his service. I regret he was injured.
Have you spoke to him since then?
I have not spoken to him
So
since
you
then.
obviously haven't honored him, nor has anyone else come to even question him about what took place, even after our committee a year ago.
I
So the
believe
bottom
that
line,
you are
sir, I'm
wrong.
still
I
talking.
believe he has
Sir,
been questioned.
General, the bottom line is that he deserved that respect like these Gold Star families deserve that respect. And to question his integrity, to question what took place on August 26th that he observed from his own eyes and sacrificed his limbs for, that you're unwilling to actually face him and actually tell him the same thing that you were willing to say to MSNBC and all the rest, which is that his recollection is incorrect and that there was no such thing, is shameful.
The Doha Agreement, because it was negotiated between the government of the United States and a State Department designated terrorist organization, the Taliban, and it was a bilateral agreement, that kind of pulled the rug out morale-wise from both the Afghan security forces and the government itself, because at that point they knew with certainty that there was a date certain.
Like you, my father was a World War II veteran. Dad was a Marine, and he told me the only thing generals ever gave him was a hard time. So I fully expect to get that from you all. You don't need to write that down, but that's just me personally. This is for either one of you.
Marine in World War II, and he said the same thing.
Do what?
That my father was a Marine in World War II with the 4th Marine Division.
That
said
was
the same
1st
thing.
Marine Division. His colonel was Chesty Puller. So thank you. This is for either one of y'all. The Taliban was in violation of the Doha Agreement. Why did we remove our troops?
I think that's a question for policymakers, not for either of us.
So you all, I guess what I want to get at is y'all weren't involved in the consultation of that.
We absolutely were involved in the consultation, and we pointed out repeatedly that the conditions were not being met.
That's what I wanted to know. Can you explain why the arbitrary deadline of August 31st was chosen as the date of removal from Afghanistan? And was the State Department or Department of Defense the ones that chose this date?
Didn't choose the date, but I can tell you some of the logic and thinking that was going behind that. So the date of May 1st is the Doha Agreement. Right. This current administration, the Biden administration, comes into office on the 20th of January. And then the first week in February, actually I think the first meeting is either the 3rd, 4th, or 5th or something like that, but the first week in February is the beginning of a 10-week deliberation that was quite rigorous, actually. Lots of meetings, lots of readers, et cetera, by the National Security Council to include the current president. And then the decision or the guidance to the State Department was to get additional time, work with the Taliban, postpone them 1 May. And I think the most that the State Department could get was, I think, whatever that is, 6 months, I think it is. So that then bounds your problem from time of decision, 14 April, not going to go with 1 May, and it takes you out X amount of days. I think it was whatever that is to the end of August, September. But that was the backstop, and that was because of negotiations between Zal Khalilzad and the Taliban as to how much he could push it to the right.
Operationally, the collapse meant that at HKIA, we depended upon Afghan support to hold the perimeter. They melted away. And that was probably the most significant immediate operational effect of the collapse of the Afghan government and the attendant collapse of the Afghan military. Now, we had a plan for that. We saw it as a possibility, but that's why we had to put in 6,000, almost 6,000 U.S. forces to replace those Afghans that had melted away. We would have been able to hold HQ with a far smaller number of U.S. forces had the Afghans remained. But when the government collapsed, they went away. So that had a profound and immediate effect on everything else that followed.
I want to ask some questions about targeting. I've watched your all's interviews from in uniform to leaving uniform. As you can imagine, it's of great personal interest to me and, of course, to the Gold Star families as well throughout the war. We left on August 30th, 2021. We lost 13 service members on the 26th of 2021. And moving behind those dates, can you recall when the last time it was that America targeted somebody specifically for the purpose of termination on the 25th, on the 24th, on the 23rd, wherever, whether it be ISIS-K, whether it be Taliban, whether it be Al-Qaeda?
Sure, on the night of 27, 28 August, we targeted an ISIS-K bomb maker in Nangarhar province. Took him
Prior
out
to the
with
26th, General.
prior
I
to
know
the
that
26th.
we made a mistaken target.
That was the
took place
29th. That was 2
after-
days later.
Prior to the 26th, prior to the Abbey Gate.
It had been quite a while before we had actually struck any deep targets. It had been a lengthy period of time. I couldn't give the exact date, but it was probably a matter of many weeks since we had struck a target that you would develop and strike as a personality target or a deep strike target. Our strikes were during the period, particularly after the Doha Agreement. We were more in direct self-defense of Afghan forces, and that became increasingly difficult to deliver as our aircraft were repositioned out of Afghanistan as we drew down. So our strikes became increasingly limited. Now, the Afghans struck, and they'd struck not only close defense targets, but deep targets, but we had very limited visibility on those targets, and I do not believe they were necessarily effective in those strikes.
Who, General Milley, gave the order to abandon Bagram?
Well, the president makes a decision, announces it on the 14th of April, and the decision very simply was withdraw U.S. forces and keep a diplomatic presence. The embassy is going to remain in Kabul, and if you're ever going to have to do a NEO, then you're going to have to use the Kabul International Airport as the evacuation airfield.
Could a NEO have taken place in a more orderly fashion had it been conducted out of Bagram versus HKIA?
Sure, but you don't have the forces to defend. It's a question that, it's a non-question in the sense that you don't have the forces to defend Bagram. Bagram would have required, roughly speaking, if U.S. forces are defending it, Bagram would have required about 5,000. If the Afghans are there with you, then you probably could have defended it with 1,800, maybe 2,000, something like that.
Sir,
But once you make the decision, Congressman, to go to remove U.S. forces, you don't have the option of keeping Bagram.
Right.
It's no longer there.
So who did give the order? Who specifically gave the order to abandon Bagram? And I assume the order was delivered to General Miller.
Well, it was General Miller's recommendation that if he's going to withdraw U.S. forces, I can't keep Bagram and HKIA and defend it with 750 guys. It's not even feasible. So that's his recommendation. The plan is brought up through the chain of command.
Was there dissent within the military? Was the order given against military advice?
To close Bagram?
Yes.
No, and that's because the previous decision is a strategic decision to withdraw U.S. forces.
General McKenzie, if I could ask, you stated that DOD and state were operating at different speeds. Do you believe that if state and DOD were on the same page, that Bagram could have remained a viable option for the NEO?
The key point the chairman made is this, sir. It's once you go below 2.5K for U.S. forces, you can't hold Bagram. At 2.5, I was enthusiastic about holding Bagram. Scott Miller was enthusiastic about holding Bagram.
Understand, but neither one of you recommended to go below.
I recommended not. My position then and now is stay at 2.5K.
And that's right.
General
But once
Milley,
the decision is made.
Right. Understand.
Presidents make decisions, and once that decision is made, we execute.
Chair recognizes Mr. Waltz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the witnesses for coming in. I got to tell you, Mr. Chairman, the more I listen to this hearing, the more infuriated I get. And I know the Gold Star families sitting here have to feel the same way. I know every veteran watching today has to feel the same way, because it's not about us. It's about them. And I think what upsets them most General Milley, General McKenzie, are some of the statements from the president during this evacuation, including an interview that the president gave on national television during the withdrawal on August 18th, saying the generals never advised me to leave 2,500, and the only air base, Bagram Air Base, in the world sandwiched between China, Russia, Iran, and a platform to stay after counterterrorism. General Milley, is that an accurate statement that the generals never advised him to leave a stay-behind force to keep a lid on half the world's terrorist organizations?
I will tell you what my thoughts were at the time, my assessment
But
at
you,
the time.
let me just say, you've testified today, you both testified repeatedly
Yes.
that you advised the National Command Authority we should leave a
2,500?
stay-behind force,
2,500
including the
plus
base.
NATO, plus the
That's right.
contract. That's correct.
Did President Trump leave that stay-behind force despite his stated desire to get everybody out because the Taliban didn't meet the conditions?
When the administrations changed hands, there were 2,500 soldiers, and that was a
Did you
decision.
then, and you've stated today you didn't advise Biden to pull everybody out, you advised him to stay.
That's correct.
So that's an inaccurate statement. But let's go down the list here. Let's go back to July of 2021. President Biden, there's a likelihood, there's going to be the Taliban overrunning everything and owning the whole country is highly unlikely. Does that comport with your knowledge at the time? In fact, you just a few weeks later said Kabul will be surrounded in 30 to 60 days.
My assessment at the time was if we went to zero in U.S. military forces, then there was a high likelihood of a collapse of the government of Afghanistan and the ANSF with the Taliban taking over.
Would collapse.
But I thought it was going to be, I personally thought it was going to be in the fall, somewhere around Thanksgiving. The assessments vary widely.
We're talking within months.
Within months of our withdrawal, that's correct.
The next one, there's going to be no circumstance where you see people being lifted off the roof of an embassy in an embassy of the United States from Afghanistan. It's not at all comparable with Saigon. I think this picture proves that not to be the case. Fair enough. Joe Biden, July 8th, 2021. Next one, Americans should understand we're going to try to get it all done before August 31st. And if you're an American, if there's American citizens left, we're going to stay to get them all out. Was that your understanding of the operational planning at the time, to stay beyond August 31st, or were you planning to get out by August 31st?
We plan to get out by August 31st.
Last, but perhaps the most egregious. We believe about 100 to 200 Americans remain in Afghanistan with some intention to leave. You both testified today, you just testified, General Milley, that it was impossible to know the number. In fact, is that accurate? It was very difficult to know the number.
Very difficult, and I don't think the numbers were accurate.
Yet the State Department's revised that number since to nearly 1,000 Americans left behind. Look, in July of 2021, Bagram is closing. We're withdrawing our four-star commander, General Milley. Ghani is visiting President Biden, practically begging us to at least leave our contractors and some little bit of air support. General McKenzie, you've testified that you were so concerned in July of 2021 that you put up recommendations including lily pads to get our allies out, putting pieces in place to process our SIVs faster, putting measures in place to get our American citizens out, to get our allies out, and to take care of what American military should do, which is protecting all Americans. You were so concerned in July of 2021, you put those recommendations forward. That's what you've testified today.
That's correct.
And in fact, also, the diplomats on the ground, Mr. Chairman, sent a dissent cable. 23 diplomats saying if you continue down this road, disaster will ensue. Was that dissent cable shared with either of you? This is a formal channel going to the Secretary of State himself. Was that shared with you as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs? Was that shared with you as the commander?
I've never seen it.
I didn't see it at the time, and I haven't seen it since, and I would like to see that dissent.
I think the American people would like to see that. Chairman, here's my question for you. Do you know where the Secretary of State was on August 13th? The day before Kabul fell, do you know where the Secretary of State was? Despite all of your concerns, that State Department wasn't planning fast enough. We weren't getting our people out. According to the Washington Post, he was in the Hamptons. He was in the Hamptons on vacation. Secretary of State Blinken. I don't know, I can't even imagine how that makes our Gold Star families feel. Look, here's the bottom line, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your indulgence. I'll close with this. The State Department, to use a military term, had its head up its rear. It wasn't planning. It, in fact, thought we could just have an embassy and the good Taliban terrorists will take care of the bad Taliban terrorists. I mean, that's essentially what happened. And because of that, we didn't get our people out. We didn't get our citizens out. We didn't have the force posture. We didn't have the basing. We failed, and their loved ones are dead because of it. I apologize to you, to my Gold Star families. Your government failed you. There is a difference, gentlemen, and I know you both know this, in taking responsibility and accountability. A lot of people have taken responsibility. No one has been held accountable, and they deserve but better. Your government failed you, and I'll give you an opportunity in my time remaining, Mr. Chairman, if there's anything you all would like to say publicly on the record.
I'll give the witnesses time to respond, but the time has expired.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
The gentlemen's, they have a right to respond.
Well, I'd like to take you up on that offer. I've talked to these families.
And I thank you for that.
I've met the other families, and I have committed to them, and I will do so again publicly to all of you, that I will work with them to get you the answers, to make sure that accountability, transparency is established. And I'm going to do that till the day I go in the grave. That's what a soldier does. And I'm not going to turn my back on these families or any other Gold Star families. There are other Gold Star families in this room right now. Jane Horton's in this room. I've been working with her for years. There's many others. And they know who I am, and I will work with them forever.
They deserve accountability, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, General Milley.